If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be standing at the edge of everything I thought I knew, I'd have laughed them right out of the room. Our life wasn't perfect, it never is, but I believed in the foundation we'd built. We had history. We had trust. Or so I thought. It started with a glance. Just a passing one. Nothing significant except that it was. Subtle shifts in behavior often give away the big things long before words do. Ryan had always been good at hiding his emotions behind a charming smile and quick wit, but lately, his gaze seemed distant, almost guilty. At first, I brushed it off as stress from work. Maybe the promotion he'd been chasing was wearing him down. Maybe I'd been overanalyzing. But then came the unexplained absences, more of them each week. His text replies grew shorter, clipped. When I asked him where he'd been during his lunch breaks, his answers felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. Something was off. The real turning point wasn't even something he did directly. It was what he didn't do. My grandmother, Eleanor, sharp, sophisticated, and every bit as cunning as she was beautiful in her prime, had been staying with us for a while after her hip surgery. Ryan had always been respectful around her, but lately I noticed strange tension between them. The kind you can't quite put your finger on, but know is wrong. I caught Eleanor's gaze lingering on Ryan for a second too long during dinner one night, her smile just a bit too warm. She adjusted the necklace at her throat in a way that struck me as deliberate, almost vain. Eleanor was always proud of how youthful she looked for her age, but that pride felt different now. That night, while Ryan pretended to be engrossed in some sports replay on TV, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty wine glass Eleanor had left behind. It was ridiculous, right? To think that my own grandmother. But ridiculous didn't mean impossible. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to shake the thought away. It wasn't some soap opera, I told myself. No one's husband actually does something that insane. Still, doubts have a way of festering. And once they settle in, they don't let go. The next day, I made a point of accidentally stopping by Ryan's office during his lunch break. He wasn't there. His assistant gave me a puzzled look, telling me she thought he was working remotely that day. I smiled, thanked her, and left, my mind spinning. By the time I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I felt like a caged animal, restless and ready to snap. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I wandered room to room, looking for something I couldn't quite name. That's when I saw it. A familiar scarf, one that didn't belong to me, draped over the back of Ryan's office chair. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I reached for it, fingers brushing against the soft fabric. It was Eleanor's, and I stood there for a long moment, holding that scarf as if it might suddenly catch fire in my hands. It was unmistakably hers, cashmere, soft as silk, and in that distinct shade of forest green she loved so much. Eleanor never went anywhere without it when the weather was even remotely chilly. My stomach churned. What possible reason could there be for my grandmother's scarf to be in Ryan's home office? There shouldn't have been any reason at all. I heard the front door open, the jangle of keys hitting the counter. Ryan's voice drifted down the hall as he called out. I took a deep breath, shoved the scarf into the nearest drawer, and plastered on a neutral expression as he rounded the corner. Hey, babe, he said with that same easy smile he'd always worn, the one that used to make me melt. But now? It felt like a mask. Where have you been? I asked, keeping my tone casual, though I could hear the edge in my own voice. His brow furrowed slightly. The gym? It wasn't a lie. He was wearing workout clothes, though they looked suspiciously fresh for someone who'd supposedly spent an hour sweating. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Which gym? He paused a second too long. You know, the usual one downtown. I nodded slowly, but didn't say anything else. His discomfort was evident now. He'd always been bad at hiding that telltale fidget of his when he was nervous. His fingers brushed over his wrist like he was checking for a watch that wasn't there. The silence stretched between us until he broke it. Is something wrong? I shrugged. I don't know. Should there be? Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it, like he wasn't quite sure what answer wouldn't dig him into a deeper hole. His hesitation felt like a confirmation of something I hadn't even wanted to admit to myself. Instead of waiting for an excuse, I turned on my heel and headed toward the kitchen, leaving him standing there. My mind was racing. Confronting him directly felt premature. I needed to be sure. That night, I waited until he fell asleep before slipping out of bed. His phone was on the nightstand. It wasn't locked. It never had been, though I'd never had a reason to check before. Now, as the soft glow of the screen lit up my face, I swallowed back the unease swirling inside me. There weren't many messages, just the usual texts from his coworkers and a few friends. But as I scrolled through, I noticed an unusual number of calls to one specific contact over the last few weeks. Eleanor. I stared at her name, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe she was just calling to check in, or maybe no. There was no world where that frequency of calls was normal. The call history blurred as anger bubbled beneath the surface. I closed the app and put the phone down quietly, though I wanted to throw it across the room. When I returned to bed, Ryan was still there, sleeping peacefully, like nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The next morning, I woke up before Ryan, still fueled by the bitterness that had settled in my chest. I went through the motions of breakfast with a robotic kind of calm, pouring coffee, buttering toast, while my mind raced. He came into the kitchen yawning, rubbing the back of his neck. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, but I stepped aside to grab the sugar. The small dodge was deliberate. He noticed. "You okay?" he asked, lingering by the counter. "Fine," I said without looking at him. It wasn't a lie. I wasn't fine in the way he thought, but I'd never been more determined. Today was the day I'd pull at every loose thread until the whole thing unraveled. After he left for work, I called Eleanor. "Darling," she answered, chipper as ever. What a surprise. "Hi, Grandma," I said, forcing a pleasant tone. "I was thinking of swinging by for a visit later." "Oh, I'd love that," she chirped. "I was just about to head out for some errands, but I'll be back by lunch." I smiled tightly. Of course she had plans. She always did. For someone in her 70s, Eleanor had the energy of a woman half her age, and apparently, the recklessness of a teenager too. By the time I arrived at her house, my nerves felt like live wires beneath my skin. Eleanor greeted me with her usual warmth, guiding me inside. Her home was pristine as always, the scent of lavender wafting from a candle on the coffee table. We settled into the living room, sipping tea as she told me about some garden club drama I barely heard. I kept nodding, murmuring in agreement, but my mind was locked onto one question. I set my cup down. "Grandma, can I ask you something personal?" Her eyes twinkled with curiosity. "Of course, dear." I leaned forward. "How often do you see Ryan when I'm not around?" The room went still, like the house itself was holding its breath. Eleanor's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a blink and you miss it moment. But it was enough. Her fingers curled around her teacup. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, though her voice wasn't quite as steady. I held her gaze, unblinking. "I saw the call logs, Grandma. His phone. Your number." She sat back, eyes widening just slightly before narrowing again in that calculating way she had. "You've been checking his phone?" she asked, deflecting like a seasoned pro. "I had to," I shot back. Since no one felt like being honest with me. Her face softened into something almost apologetic, but not quite ashamed. "Daria, it's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I challenged. She hesitated, lips pressing into a thin line. "He needed someone to talk to." My laugh was sharp, humorless.
Right.
"My husband needed emotional support from my 73-year-old grandmother's." Eleanor's expression flickered, the mask slipping. She wasn't used to being cornered like this. "It's complicated. Try me." Her silence was damning. My chest felt tight as the truth settled deeper. Whatever she was about to say wouldn't undo the cracks in my life. It would only shatter what was left. Eleanor exhaled slowly, like she was letting go of some invisible weight. "You're not going to like this," she said quietly. "Try me," I repeated, my voice sharper now. She set her teacup down carefully, like the porcelain might break under the weight of her confession. It started after his birthday dinner. That night when you were running late from work, I felt my heart sink. I remembered that night. I'd stayed late to finish a project, texting Ryan to go ahead without me. When I got home, everything had seemed normal enough. But now, every memory of that evening felt warped. Eleanor continued, her voice calm in a way that made me want to scream. Ryan came over to drop off some leftovers for me. We had a glass of wine. He was venting about, feeling like he wasn't enough for you anymore. I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms. And that led to what, exactly? She hesitated, just long enough for the nausea to twist in my stomach. One thing led to another. Those 4 words hit me like a slap. I stared at her, feeling unmoored, like the floor had disappeared beneath me. I wasn't hearing this. I couldn't be hearing this. My voice came out low, almost foreign to my own ears. You slept with him. Her silence was the only answer I needed. You slept with my husband, I repeated, louder this time, letting the weight of the betrayal settle between us like poison. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? How disgusting. Eleanor flinched but didn't deny it. It was a mistake, she whispered. A terrible, stupid mistake. I laughed bitterly. A mistake is burning dinner. A mistake is locking your keys in the car. This was a choice. You looked at him and thought, why not? Her composure cracked then, and she finally looked ashamed. He was vulnerable, Daria. And I was lonely. It was never supposed to happen again. Again? My voice was barely more than a whisper now, the word scraping its way up my throat. How many times? Eleanor buried her face in her hands. Just twice.
Twice.
I felt like I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around me, and I had to steady myself against the armrest. Twice was 2 times too many. And Ryan? I asked, swallowing hard. What did he say afterward? She lifted her head slowly, eyes glassy. He regrets it more than you know. He begged me to pretend it never happened, to move on.
Move on.
The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. They'd both expected me to live my life in blissful ignorance, while their betrayal festered beneath the surface. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stood abruptly. You two deserve each other, I spat. Eleanor reached for my hand, but I yanked it away. Daria, please. I'm done listening. My voice trembled with anger. He doesn't get to play the victim here, and neither do you. Without another word, I grabbed my bag and stormed out. The afternoon sun was blinding as I stepped outside, but the heat on my face felt colder than the fury boiling inside me. Ryan's car wasn't in the driveway when I got home.
Good.
I needed time to process, to figure out what came next. But as I stood in the quiet of our kitchen, surrounded by photos of a life I thought we'd built together, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Ryan came home just after sunset, his keys jingling in the lock like a countdown. I didn't move from where I stood in the living room, arms crossed and eyes locked on the front door. When he walked in, his tired smile faltered the second he saw me. Hey, he said cautiously, like he knew the storm was coming but didn't know where it would hit. Sit down, I said, voice steady but cold. He hesitated. Daria, what's going on? I know. The 2 words sliced through the air, and his face went pale. I know everything. He froze, his bag slipping from his shoulder to the floor. For a second, he looked like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar, wide-eyed, cornered. Everything's... I stepped forward, narrowing the space between us. Do I need to spell it out?
You.
Eleanor. Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence spoke louder than any confession. I felt my chest tighten, but I refused to break.
Not now.
You lied to me, I continued, letting the full weight of it settle in. You made me question myself. You made me think I was paranoid. And the whole time, you were sneaking around behind my back, with my own grandmother. His face twisted in shame. I never wanted you to find out. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, that makes it so much better. Ryan took a step closer, hands raised like he was approaching a wounded animal. Please, Daria, let me explain. I backed away. Explain what? That you got bored and decided to hook up with someone who is practically family? It wasn't like that, he said quickly. I was lost. You were working so much, and I started feeling invisible. Eleanor was, she listened. She listened? My voice cracked with incredulity. So what? You decided the best way to thank her was to wreck everything we had? Ryan's eyes glistened as he rubbed his face, like he was trying to wipe the guilt away. I hate myself for what I did. I swear it was never about love. It was a mistake. A terrible, selfish mistake. I wanted to believe that. A small, stupid part of me wanted to believe there was a version of this story where he wasn't the villain. But the reality of what he'd done crushed that hope before it could take root. Do you have any idea how sick this is? I asked, taking a shaky breath. How humiliating it is for me to know that everyone could find out that I'll be the wife whose husband cheated with her grandmother. Do you know what that does to someone's? Ryan stepped closer, his voice raw. Please don't give up on us. I'll do anything, counseling, moving away, whatever it takes to fix this. I stared at him, searching his face for the man I used to know. The one who swore he'd never hurt me. But all I saw now was a stranger who'd shattered everything we built. You can't unbreak something like this, I whispered. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the mantel, counting down the seconds of our unraveling. Ryan's shoulders slumped. He looked defeated, like he'd been expecting this but hoping for a miracle. I don't know how to live without you, he said quietly. That's the only honest thing you've said today, I replied, grabbing my keys from the counter. But it doesn't change what you did. Where are you going? I paused at the door. I don't know yet. But you're not coming with me? As I walked out, the night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold. My mind raced as I got into my car. I didn't know where I'd go, but one thing was clear. Ryan wasn't the only one who was going to pay for this. Eleanor wasn't getting off easy either. I drove aimlessly for a while, the headlights painting streaks of light on the empty streets. My mind replayed everything like a film reel I couldn't turn off. Ryan's guilt, Eleanor's excuses, it all swirled together into something that felt unreal. Eventually, I found myself parked outside my best friend Lena's house. She'd always said her door was open, no matter what time it was. Tonight I was going to take her up on that. The second she opened the door and saw my face, her brows knitted in concern. Daria? I didn't say anything. I just walked inside, and she shut the door behind me. Wine or something stronger? She asked, leading me to the couch. Stronger, I muttered, collapsing into the cushions. A few minutes later, she handed me a glass of whiskey and sat beside me, eyes full of worry. All right, spill. I stared at the glass in my hands. The words tasted bitter, even before I spoke them. Ryan cheated on me. Lena's face hardened. That bastard. Who's the other woman? I let out a hollow laugh. You're not going to believe it. Try me. I looked her straight in the eyes. Eleanor. Lena blinked, as if she'd misheard me. Then her jaw dropped.
Wait.
Eleanor? As in your grandmother Eleanor? I nodded, my throat tight. The shock on her face mirrored how I'd felt when I first figured it out. She stared at me for a moment, then set her drink down carefully. I have no words, she finally said. That's beyond messed up. You think? I said, taking a long sip of whiskey. I thought I was losing my mind. But now I know for sure, it's real. Lena shook her head slowly. What are you going to do? I stared at the amber liquid swirling in my glass. I don't know yet. But I'm not letting either of them get away with this. Lena's eyes sharpened. Good. You shouldn't. She reached out and squeezed my hand. Whatever you need, I've got you. The warmth of her support steadied me. I wasn't alone in this, even if it felt like I was drowning. I stayed at Lena's house for a while, trying to clear my head. By the time I left, the whiskey had dulled the sharpest edges of my anger, but not the resolve underneath it. When I got home, Ryan was still awake, sitting in the dark with his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, eyes red. You didn't leave for good, he said quietly, like he couldn't believe it.
Not yet, I replied.
But don't think for a second that means you've been forgiven. Ryan nodded, like he knew there was no point arguing. I walked past him without another word and headed upstairs. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind was already working on what needed to happen next. Eleanor couldn't pretend this never happened. And Ryan? He was about to learn just how persistent I could be. Morning came too soon, the sunlight streaming through the window like an unwelcome guest. I dragged myself out of bed, knowing exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to be another silent victim of betrayal. Ryan was already in the kitchen, looking like he hadn't slept a minute. He watched me carefully, like I was a live wire that might spark at any moment. I made coffee, he offered. I ignored him and grabbed my own mug. The sound of the coffee pouring was the only noise between us. I wasn't in the mood for small talk or pity. I'm going to see Eleanor, I said flatly. Ryan's eyes widened. Daria, please don't. I set the mug down harder than I meant to, the ceramic clinking against the countertop. She doesn't get to hide from this. Neither do you. He ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate. I'll go with you. I'll explain. No, I cut him off. You've explained enough. This is between me and her now. Ryan didn't argue after that. He just slumped into his chair, defeated.
Good.
He should feel defeated. I grabbed my keys and headed out, the anger simmering beneath my skin like a low flame. The drive to Eleanor's felt longer than usual, though it was only 15 minutes away. I rehearsed what I was going to say in my head, but every time I imagined her face, the calm, practiced grace she always wore, I felt my composure slipping. By the time I pulled into her driveway, I wasn't sure if I wanted to scream at her or break down completely. But I wasn't leaving without answers. Eleanor opened the door, as if she'd been expecting me. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her hair perfectly styled, her expression calm but wary.
Daria, she said softly.
I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk. She closed the door behind me, folding her hands neatly in front of her. I figured you'd come. I turned to face her, arms crossed. You figured? Is that what you've been doing this whole time? Figuring out how to keep me in the dark? Eleanor's calm wavered, just slightly. I never wanted it to go this far. I laughed bitterly. You mean you never wanted me to find out? Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stepped closer, my voice steady but sharp. You're supposed to be my family. You're supposed to be someone I can trust. Instead, you betrayed me in the worst way possible. Why, Eleanor? Why him? Her face softened, but I didn't see regret. I saw something more selfish. I was lonely, Daria. You have no idea what it's like. Watching your life slow down while everyone else keeps moving forward. I stared at her, disgusted. So, you decided to steal a piece of mine? You could have found anyone, but you chose him. My husband. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't let her. Do you know what the worst part is? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. It wasn't just some random fling. You had the audacity to stand there at our anniversary dinner and toast to our future, while you were sleeping with him. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of my words finally hit her. But I wasn't done. You don't get to play the victim here, I continued. You took something from me. Something I'll never get back. And you did it knowing full well what it would do to me if I ever found out. She finally looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. I'm sorry, Daria. I truly am. Sorry isn't enough, I said quietly. Sorry doesn't erase the lies. Sorry doesn't put my marriage back together. Eleanor reached out, but I took a step back.
Don't.
Just don't. I turned and headed for the door, my heart pounding. As I reached for the handle, I paused. You and Ryan deserve whatever happens next. I'm done protecting either of you. With that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. The weight in my chest felt a little lighter, but the rage was still there, burning steady. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. When I got home, Ryan was still sitting in the same spot, like he hadn't moved since I left. His head snapped up when he heard the door, his face filled with a flicker of hope that made me sick to my stomach. How did it go? He asked cautiously. I dropped my keys on the counter and looked at him, really looked at him. The man who used to make me laugh until I cried. The man I thought I'd grow old with. And now, he was a stranger who had destroyed everything. "How do you think it went?" asked coldly. Ryan swallowed hard, rubbing his face with his hands. "Daria, I know there's nothing I can say that will make this better, but I need you to know that I would do anything, to fix this." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You don't get to fix this. You don't get to make things right. You broke something that can't be put back together." "I was stupid," he whispered, his voice breaking. It wasn't about her.
It was never about Eleanor.
It was about me being weak and selfish. "You got that right," I shot back, the anger rising again. "But you didn't just hurt yourself, you ruined me. You made me question everything I thought was real." Ryan got up and took a step toward me. "I love you. I've never stopped loving you." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "If this is love, Ryan, I'd rather be alone." Silence fell between us, thick and suffocating. Then he surprised me by falling to his knees in front of me, gripping my hands desperately. "Please," he choked out.
"Please, Daria.
"I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. I can't lose you." I stared down at him, this man who once seemed invincible, now reduced to a broken mess.
But it didn't move me.
I was tired of his pleas, tired of the lies. "You already lost me," I said softly, pulling my hands away. Ryan crumpled, his head hanging low, as if he finally understood that there was no redemption in this story. The sound of his sobs followed me as I walked past him, up the stairs, and into the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the life we'd built, now nothing more than debris in the aftermath of his betrayal. But I wasn't done. There was still one more thing I needed to do. I grabbed my laptop and opened my email. The message was already half-formed in my mind as I typed. "To the family, I wanted you all to hear this from me before the gossip starts. Ryan cheated on me with Eleanor." I filled in the details, careful but brutal. No theatrics, just the truth. By the time I hit send, I felt like I'd finally reclaimed a piece of my power. I sat back, staring at the screen. The fallout would be nuclear, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about vengeance, it was about making sure the truth wasn't buried. Eleanor had spent her life manipulating people, wrapping them around her finger. This time, she wasn't walking away unscathed. The first reply came almost immediately. "My cousin Emily, what the hell? Are you serious?" Another message popped up. My uncle, furious and confused. Then another and another. The secret was out, and it was spreading like wildfire. Downstairs, I could hear Ryan pacing as if he knew the walls were closing in. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. By the time I went to bed, my phone was buzzing nonstop with calls and messages. I ignored them all. Tomorrow, I'd sort through the wreckage. Tonight, I'd sleep knowing that, for the first time in weeks, I'd told the truth out loud. As I lay in the dark, I didn't cry. I didn't feel the crushing sadness I thought I would. What I felt was freedom. This was the end of one story, but the beginning of another. And this time, I wasn't letting anyone else write it for me.